Another couple of minutes.
There we go. Some people are coming in now.
Great.
Good morning. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We'll get started in just a couple minutes here. We know that a lot of folks are rushing in on the snowy morning. Hope everyone is staying warm.
And for those of you who are parents, have figured out what to do with your children who don't have school today.
Suppose they're more than welcome to watch if they're really excited about land acquisition and conservation. I'll just give folks another minute or two. And again, we'll be doing a few round robin presentations and discussions, but we'll also have a good Q&A time. So as we're going, please use that Q&A function to start putting your questions in.
Yep. You have access to the chat, but we ask you to put any questions that you have in the Q&A function. That way we can track them that way. Hi, Melissa.
Yes. Hello, Melissa.
Kristen would be happy to shoot you a copy once it's ready.
Yep. And for anyone that just joined, this will be recorded, so we plan to be able to share this out.
Okay. Well, let's get started because I know we have quite a bit to get through. And I see that we have about 51 folks on so far, hoping that more people will be trickling in, but welcome one and all. We're really excited for today. Thank you so much for coming. But before we get started, I just wanted to give a little bit of an introduction before we get into this fantastic panel that we have planned for you this morning. I want to tell you a little bit about CCP for the members who might, for those that might not be members yet. Chesapeake Conservation Partnership is who's hosting this webinar. I'm the program director for the partnership, and it's a coalition of over 90 different diverse organizations and agencies, all engaged in land conservation here in the Chesapeake watershed. And we're really working to accelerate conservation throughout the region for multiple benefits, whether it's economic sustainability, scenic, historic, cultural heritage, working lands, important wildlife habitat, water quality, or overall quality of life. We're also working closely with Chesapeake Wild, which is most well known for the Chesapeake Wild grants that you may have heard of, which, by the way, are expected to launch another new RFP later this month. But CCP was formed to really help ensure that the region is on track for the Chesapeake Bay program goal set in back in 2010 of protecting additional 2 million acres by 2025. And more recently, we really committed to help partners protect 30% of the watershed by the year 2030, and doing so equitably for the benefit of all. So to do this, it means we really need to greatly accelerate the pace of equitable permanent land conservation in our region. And for that to be successful, we really need partners working together, from the individual landowner that wants permanently conserve their land, all the way up to the federal agencies. And federal agencies can really be fantastic partners in these efforts to conserve lands. And the land and water conservation funds that are permanently authorized thanks to the Great American Outdoors Act can really help a lot of these opportunities become a reality. But we've been talking to a lot of y'all on the phone and a lot of our different partners over the last few months, and a lot of partners, especially nonprofits and land trusts, who have these relationships with willing landowners who want to permanently preserve the land. Many really aren't sure, how can they partner with the federal government, or which park, refuge, forest, piece of land nearby, which agency might be interested. Many land trusts and conservancies are much more used to working on the state side, or much more used to working with state agencies. And I know many of you in the audience are wondering, how federal agencies in the region make land acquisitions. How do they develop priority lists? Where can they work? What can working with them look like? So if you're wondering that, you're in the right place. So I'm so excited to have the pleasure of bringing together this all-star lineup. We have experts from BLM, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, U.S. Forest Service, National Park Service. We're really excited for them to be able to discuss their processes. These senior federal acquisitions experts, they're going to present their project selection process, including different sources and eligibility criteria, the timing of their annual processes, the use of their easements, other caveats, all these types of things really regarding the development of quality projects. But before we jump into that panel, I do want to introduce the man who first thought up with this idea for this webinar. He's worked with partners to help conserve tens of thousands of acres over his long career at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, before now joining the Chesapeake Conservancy as the Chesapeake Fellow, and he continues to be an invaluable resource in permanent land conservation in the region. Joe?
Thanks, Ben, for that very kind introduction. So just continuing with the with the introductory remarks, it's often useful, almost always useful, to look back and assess progress toward goals and where we've been, and assess that against where we are in today's environment. And Ben mentioned the 2 million acre goal, and many of you on the call will remember the source of that, and that being President Obama's executive order on restoration and protection of the Chesapeake Bay from 2009. That executive order kicked off an amazing amount of activity, including the formation of the Chesapeake Conservation Partnership, which today is still functioning well over a decade later. That executive order also, in addition to creating the 2 million acre land conservation goal, eventually led to some other initiatives like the LWCF landscape collaboratives. And I'm not going to go into any detail about that, but it was an era that brought increased LWCF funding on the federal side. And to be clear, that's what we're going to focus on today, is the federal side of Land and Water Conservation Fund. There is a state side that we're not going to get into. So just to be clear on that. So fast forward to where we are today, and we have another executive order. And it was promulgated by President Biden, Executive Order 14008, in January of 2021. And that kicked off the Biden administration's America the Beautiful initiative. And so we have, we have these two executive orders which direct federal agencies to engage and increase their efforts to conserve additional habitat. And so what's important about that is in this era, we have support, we have encouragement, we have direction from above. Back in the collaborative era, that was a very top-down initiative, and it mixed. I think it met with some mixed results in the Chesapeake. The newer executive order really isn't quite that specific, but certainly gives us all the marching orders and support and funding. Actually, there's a large amount of funding available in addition to Land and Water Conservation Fund. But it gives us the direction, and here's some of the language from the report that came out after the executive order was promulgated. And it talks about creating more parks and safe outdoor opportunities, supporting tribally led conservation and restoration priorities, expanding collaborative conservation of fish and wildlife habitats and corridors, and increasing access for outdoor recreation. So those are things that we're all about. And so we have this opportunity. We have the executive order. We have the backing to very top of this administration. So today we're going to learn from real estate experts in the federal agencies what their processes are so that all of us can understand those processes better and work where we have the opportunity. And we'll find out that there are restricted geographical areas that come into play when you're working with federal agencies. But there's still many opportunities to collaborate and work together to achieve these goals that we all are working so hard to achieve. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our facilitator extraordinaire, Bill Potapchek, who has been working with Chesapeake Conservation Partnership for many years and is very, very knowledgeable and will help us guide us through this important webinar. So thank you all for participating. Thanks to our panelists. Look forward to a great morning.
Good morning, all. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Ben. Delighted to be with you. Chase, if you can switch to the panelists, that would be ideal. Folks, we have an all-star lineup. Ben and colleagues did an extraordinary job of tracking down key people at 4 different agencies to really get a set of folks who can help us dig in to what for many is a fairly opaque process. It's a window that you can't see through. And so this is an opportunity to learn more about how different federal agencies work. We all knew intuitively when we were planning this that different federal agencies have different restrictions, and we learn more about them as we plan this session. And so the folks who are with you today include from the Bureau of Land Management, Jeff Cartwright, who's the Public Land Access Program Manager and the lead around LWCF dollars. From the National Park Service, we have Jen Cherry, Acting Deputy Chief for Land Resources. She may be joined by Nadine Lazem a little later in the call, who's the National Program Center Chief. We have 2 key folks from Forest Service. If you've worked with federal agencies before, sometimes the Chesapeake Bay watershed is in different regions of the same federal agency. And so from the U.S. Forest Service, we have Al Foster from the southern region, and Dean Lutz, who's the Regional Land Adjustment Program Officer. And lastly, from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Mark McGinney, who's the Realty Chief. And so we're delighted to have these folks with you today. Each of them is going to talk for 8 to 10 minutes to give you an overview of their agency's processes, how their priority setting works, some of the basics around eligibility to help kick off the conversation. Then Ben and I will be asking questions of the panelists to dig into their work, what they do, some of the specifics of how their agency works. And you are strongly encouraged, and I can't say strongly loud enough, to put questions into Q&A. We really want to get at what you want to learn. And so if there's a question that emerges in your head as you listen to people talk, please toss it into Q&A. Some of the questions you ask will respond in the little Q&A function. For others, we'll be unmuting you and asking you to state the question. And I often find in these kinds of conversations that it's the follow-up questions that are most important. So we want to engage you not only with the lead question, but with the follow-up question so you can dig into what you're hoping to learn. So that's how the flow will work today. Delighted you are with us on this snowy Friday. And I'm going to turn us over to Jeff Cartwright. Jeff, over to you.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. So let's see. Let me share my screen.
Let me stop sharing now, Jeff. There you go.
Okay, here we go. All right. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. So, thank you guys for inviting me to be here. Really appreciate it, and really excited to share some information about the eastern side of BLM, which is very sparse and almost unheard of. It's like the white elephant that people can't seem to find, or Sasquatch or something. You know, it's the BLM somewhere in the east. So my name is Jeff Cartwright. I'm the Public Land Access Program Manager for the BLM, and that includes the Land and Water Conservation Fund is the majority of my effort. I also manage our Dingle Act nomination list, which is where the public can nominate areas of land that that should be acquired, public land that should be get access to, and then I'm also supporting our Mapland Act, our efforts in the Mapland Act, which is digitizing all of our easements and access reservations across the non-federal land to get to the federal land. So a couple of key, some connection there between LWCF and land acquisitions as we dive into our criteria. You'll see some of that. So I'm going to share with you today our process, what makes a good project, what criteria we use, and then as I said, we'll answer questions later. So with that, we'll go into this. So what makes a good land acquisition for the Bureau of Land Management in the Chesapeake Bay area and anywhere, frankly? So identifying priority access. So first off, we have to have an agency priority. And in the Chesapeake area, we have two priority areas that we're working on, which I'll cover in a little bit. I'm sure most of you are already familiar with that. And then we need to have a willing landowner. That's really critical, and with landowner expectations. And that is super important because of project readiness. As mentioned earlier, the collaborative landscapes within the Chesapeake Bay, we still have $1.4 million that the BLM is sitting on trying to spend in the Meadowwood area. And so we have to have projects ready to go, and the more ready they are, the more likely they are to get funding and be successful, obviously. And then we coordinate with all the parties well in advance of funding and to develop the requests. And that's, when I say all the parties, that's our agency folks, our non-federal parties, our non-federal government organizations, and then the landowner, of course, obviously being very critical and needing to be extremely patient with the federal process. As some of you have experienced, this takes a long time for the federal government to process a land acquisition. And then our partnerships are extremely critical across the entire country. I would say for the BLM, at least 80% of all of our land acquisitions are facilitated by a non-federal partner who is helping build those relationships with the landowners, helping to assist in the process through various methods, to include paying for appraisals and getting them done sooner, contracting the appraisals for us, and other of the due diligence that's required by the government to process a land acquisition. So I'll get into the process here in just a little bit, but I wanted to cover our criteria first. So we have two pots of money that we really focus on with our criteria. We have the, as mentioned, this is the federal side funding. So we get pots of money, what we call congressional line items or presidential budget. And that's where we request through the president's budget to Congress a specific amount of money for a specific project. And so those are what we call our core projects or our project criteria or presidential projects. And so on the screen, you'll see the main categories that we analyze each and every project over. Highlighting a couple of things on here, you'll see things like America the Beautiful initiative, which is the 30% by 3030, Justice 40, underserved communities. It's really we're really finding the BLM can be impactful in rural communities, and we were finding that the BLM supports communities where people need to hunt and fish on public lands in order to put food on their table. So, and just getting peace of mind and being outdoors and refreshing the life that you live and reducing stress and those sorts of things. Strong local partner support. I mentioned project readiness, and then our BLM state director's priorities and the Dingle Act nomination process. And I did look last night, and somebody did nominate the Meadowood area as a Dingle Act parcel where the BLM should consider prioritizing getting access to. So that's a nice connection with the Chesapeake. And then recently, our director added the Inflation Reduction Act. The BLM has created some priority areas where they're going to focus on restoration of landscapes. And so any connections with our LWCF projects with those project areas also get additional consideration. And then our recreation access pot of money. So that's a pot of money that Congress gives us that we can have a little bit more discretion on deciding where we're going to spend that money and what projects we want to prioritize our recreational access. A lot of the same criteria, focusing more on the quality and quantity of recreation access, but also taking into account some of the same things like serving underserved communities, people getting outdoors and recreating, and supporting the America the Beautiful initiatives as well. So a lot of the same criteria, just different focus, recreation access versus land conservation. So on our project area side, that's where we do our conservation easements mostly. That's where we do any acquisitions that support like national conservation areas or habitat restoration or anything like that. Recreation access is also very important, but different priority. And now we have another pot of money that I'll talk about in just a minute. So what is our process? This is a long way of talking about it. This is very detailed. Just trying to be transparent, show you everything that happens and our timing. So right now I'm developing the next year's call for nominations, and the BLM, we call for our recreation access projects and our presidential budget projects at the same time. And then we analyze them at the same time, but they're funded at different times. And I'll cover that in a second. So we have so we do a call for projects. People put in their projects. We rely heavily on our nonprofit or nonprofit partners or non-federal partners to work those projects and make them strong. Getting letters of support from the communities, other organizations, helping prepare information, maps, digging up information that needs to be put into the application. So we rely very heavily on our non-federal partners to put together the applications. And then once the applications are received, we have a robust voting panel, review panel that comes together, and they make a recommendation to the director on the priority of funding based upon the list and projects that were submitted. And so the review team meets and ranks, and then we do a final ranking review. So they do an initial review on their own, and then we come together as a group and we hash it out and we review every project in detail again, have a lot of conversations behind closed doors talking about the projects, and then come up with a recommendation. I brief the director in June, and then in July, early July, we provide information to our Assistant Secretary for Lands and Minerals Management, who also approves our list that goes to Congress. And then we submit in July to the Department of Interior. That July 20th was last year's deadline. Not sure what this year's deadline is going to look like, but it'll probably be right around the same time. And so to illustrate that in picture, this is what it looks like. It's very complex. So basically we're running both recreation access and our core funding or our project funding at the same time. And then they split once we have a decision on our core projects and what's going on in the president's budget. We hold on to our rec access projects and we wait for a budget. So we already have for 2024, we already have all of our recreation access projects prioritized and ready to fund. We just need to know how much money we get from Congress, and then we can get that list approved, and then we transmit the list of projects to Congress. So this is just a picture of what it looks like. So what does our budget actually look like is the other question. And then this is where I'll get into talking about a little bit additional information here. So prior to, just to kind of give you an illustration of how much the BLM benefited from the Great American Outdoors Act, the mandatory $900 million funding. Our average funding prior to the Great American Outdoors Act was between $20 and $40 million was what we would get total for BLM each year. So we didn't get very much money compared to some of the other agencies. Since then, you can see our total funding. So 2021 was the first year we got Great American Outdoors Act funding. You can see the 21 and 22 totals and our 23 totals. You can see BLM keeps creeping up a little bit more and more and more. And then what our projected budget is for the 24. Now in this, you'll see emergency and in holdings. Sometimes Congress gives that to us as emergency hardship and in holdings. The $13.5 million for that is discretionary, and the BLM truly uses that for emergencies. I mentioned that land acquisitions take a long time, and sometimes property values creep up after we get the funding, and so we use that pot of money primarily to pay for those differences. So if we requested $1 million for our project and the appraisal comes in at 1.5 million, we dip into that account to cover the extra 500,000. We also use it to fund priority in holdings within like national conservation areas and things that are true emergencies where we don't have time to wait for a budget, where a landowner is, you sell it to us now, or I'll sell it to you now, or not at all. And then we have to move faster on that. We don't have time to wait the 2 years it takes to get a president's budget through the process. And then we also have our acquisition management. That's the funds we use to pay for like appraisals, staff time, and those sorts of things. So how does this all relate to the Chesapeake? So I talked with or got some messages from Mitch Leverett, who's the state director for the Eastern states. And this was his quote. I'll let you guys all read that for yourself, but the recreation management areas within the Chesapeake Bay watershed are a priority still for the BLM. Like I said, there's still $1.4 million on the table for the Meadowwoods area that Congress allocated through the collaborative process during the Obama administration. And so what are those two areas that BLM focuses on? And I'm lucky because we only have two little small areas, and they're not very big compared to the western part of the BLM that we talk about. But in Meadowwoods, recreation is obviously, it's a huge mountain biking area, lots of trails, lots of activity in that area. Recreation is a priority, environmental education, and then wild horse and burros. Who would have thought wild horse and burros in the east? But then Douglas Point, also recreation, and that's more of an outdoor experience, getting outdoors and enjoying the outside, wildlife habitat and cultural resources. And then we will have more questions later. So that's the conclusion of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Jeff, that was extraordinary. You packed a ton of information into that short presentation. We really appreciate it. And yes, we will circle back for questions, and I see a couple already in the Q&A already, so we will get to those. Right now, we're going to move to the National Park Service and Jen Cherry and Nadine Latham. Jen, over to you.
Okay. I'm trying to share my screen.
It's working.
Oh, it is. Yay. Okay. I can't see it on my end. Okay. So Nadine is joining us, and Nadine's the primary speaker today for National Park Service, but I'm Jen Cherry. I'm the acting deputy chief of the Land Resources Division for the National Park Service Washington office. And my specialty is more on the acquisition side. Nadine is our numbers and budget person. So she's going to dive in on that aspect of our program. Nadine, can you see the slide move ahead?
Yes,
Okay,
absolutely. But okay, Jen, do you want to talk about this? This is the hardcore realty stuff. Jeff talked about federal land acquisition. We should just all say what Jeff said. What Jeff said.
Yeah. Okay.
That's okay.
Well, I can. So we kind of break down our process to the planning side when the parks are deciding, well, what is the mission of the park? What do they need to protect? Do they need to protect it in fee? Do they need to protect it in easement? Can it be protected by partners? There's all sorts of planning that goes on for established parks and new parks, NEPA process, tribal consultation, all sorts of planning and public outreach, finding out what the priorities for that park unit are. Nadine will mention this, but all of our parks have their own missions, essentially. They have what they are protecting for the American people, whether it's a historic site, a natural resource, a cultural site. So all of our parks are different, and they all have their own unique legislation. So that's something unique about National Park Service, is that we have all these 430 plus little entities with their own authorities. And this initial phase is when we're planning and we're deciding what, and this will change over time depending on development pressures and everything else, but we're deciding what within these Park Service established boundaries, and that's another thing to note for Park Service, is we have boundaries that we have to work within these parameters, but what we can acquire in those boundaries, what maybe, according to our legislation, we can acquire immediately adjacent to our boundaries or outside our boundaries. So this is all, the first stage is all that preliminary planning. And then we get into funding, which Nadine is going to jump into. And we will talk about how the funding works for that. But this slide really just kind of gives, we like to manage expectations with our partners and landowners and let them know that the federal process, as Jeff mentioned, is not, I wouldn't say we're not nimble. We're not as nimble as the private sector. We have a lot of hoops to jump through for a reason. We have to make sure what we're investing money in for the American public is worthy of protecting. And so we have to make sure that we're doing environmental site assessments, appraisals, reviewing maps and surveys. We have to know where things are on the ground. There's a lot of title that review that goes into this. And then the end of the process is really where we get into the benefits, relocation benefits, kind of the carrots that we can offer landowners and partners to work with us, because you are incredibly patient to wait through our whole process, but there's things that we can bring to the table as federal agencies that encourage you to work with us in terms of we can reimburse certain expenses, and we can offer relocation if someone's living on the property. So there's all sorts of things we in Park Service can do. So this is kind of a slide just to give you the overall timeline. Projects that are not complicated, 6 months to a year. Projects that are complicated, we've been working on for over 12 years. So that kind of just gives you that background. So, and this is where Nadine really comes into play, is how we actually fund our acquisition once it's been prioritized.
Yeah. So most people are familiar with the process that's going on the Hill right now the federal appropriation for each fiscal year. And we have, in the Park Service, a way to decide what goes before Congress and is requested for each fiscal year. And that's our land acquisition ranking system. We've used it for a while now. It is based on the mission and goals of the Park Service. And so we assess each request against the resource that's being protected at the individual unit. We assess whether or not there's impact for visitors, and we also look at the prior year funding, what has happened at that park in the past, because as a lot of us realize as we work in this area, once it's kind of like a snowball, which is happening outside my window. Once you get started, that momentum really picks up. And so if we've got a landowner who has a positive experience with us, when their neighbor's ready to move south or move north, they're going to be more willing to work with us. So we look at that as well. We kind of look at the intangibles as well as the tangibles when we assign points, ranking and rating each of the requests that comes in annually. And that request comes in starting at the park level. They are the ones who know best the importance of the resource that we would be looking to protect. They submit, the park staff submits the request. Our regional realty offices review them for criteria that's very specific to the actual resource within the park unit. After the regional offices review it, the requests get elevated to the Washington office, where we look at overarching things, as Jeff was talking about, like, does it fit America the Beautiful? Are we looking at underserved communities? Is this something that's going to help us have a better relationship with Indigenous groups around the unit? So we've got different types of criteria that are looked at in different places based on, what that ranking group is going to know most and be best able to actually assess what's been written down. Because quite frankly, with 430 plus units and 84 million acres, there's 3 extra zeros there, 84 million acres, we all don't have time to go and look at each individual square acre, mile, inch, foot, whatever. So we rely on people who are closest to the topics that are being looked at in order to provide the ranking at that point. The president, what goes into the president's budget, as we all know, that depends on the administration. Enough said. So the president's budget that's before Congress now, that hopefully will be passed, has a request for right around 60 million for at the individual lines that would come through this ranking system. And we looked at a broad spectrum. We also try to see, can we kind of spread that out across the country? So quite frankly, all of that money would not go to the mid-Atlantic states, but a good portion of it often does. A lot of times things that are here in the mid-Atlantic and the Chesapeake Bay, because of the dynamic realty market, fit more broadly into our emergencies national line item or our in holdings national line item, which are lump sum pots of money that we get in addition to the individual park unit requests. And those pots of money, as Jeff said, are available off budget cycle when a landowner cannot afford to wait through the president's budget cycle. Okay. Next slide, Jen. Go for it.
Yeah, and I know I think we're at our minute warning. But I just wanted to point out a resource that's available to you all, and I didn't even try to do this as live time. So these are PDF screenshots. But there's this, you can go to the National Park Service site and look up TraxNet AGOL Public. And this is a great resource where you can look for, and it's not just Park Service, there's other public lands on these maps, but you can add the Chesapeake Bay watershed and it will show up on this map, and you can zoom in and find out which units are in the watershed and who you could work with, which parks you may want to work with within the Chesapeake Bay watershed for the National Park Service. So I just wanted to let you know this is out there as a great resource. You can zoom in, you can see where these all play. So something for people to find, but you can always reach out to us for more information and we can walk you through how to get to those resources.
Thank you, Jen.
Yep, and this was the last thing. This will be in your materials. This is just a flyer about the acquisition process that can go out to everybody, and you can distribute this to landowners as well.
Super. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Nadine. That was wonderful. And I'm sure there's going to be follow-up questions. Folks, please use that Q&A function. Next, we're going to move to the U.S. Forest Service with Al Foster and Dean Lutz. Al, are you going to kick it off for us?
No, sir. Actually, Dean will.
Okay.
Thanks, Al. I'm going to try to share my screen here. You guys all, is that coming up for you?
Yes, perfect.
Fantastic. Yep. Sorry, just moved it. So, yeah, thanks guys for this opportunity. It's pretty interesting being with all the panel members from different agencies. Al and I are from two different regions. I'm located up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I'm the Regional Land Adjustment Program Manager for Region 9. Al's my counterpart down in Atlanta, Georgia for Region 8. And we do see some overlap between our regions. We butt up next to each other and have very similar processes and resource concerns. So with us, our respective areas or forests where we overlap mostly with this area is going to be with the Monongahela National Forest in Region 9, and our neighbor there, the George Washington Jefferson National Forest, right adjacent to it. So, but in Region 9, we have 14 forests that expand over about 20 states. It starts from Minnesota, goes down to Missouri, and kind of zigzags its way up to Maine. And just south of that is Al's. Al, I don't remember how many forests you guys have down there in your southern regions, but I know it's pretty extensive.
14.
Yeah. So anyway, we'll start with ours. That kind of gives a little background with the Forest Service. So we're dealing with two regions with Chesapeake watershed with Al and I. Our agencies, it's very similar to the other agencies that is spoken to. Forest Service has, we all have our little intricacies of our mission and stuff. So when the Forest Service looks into land acquisitions, what we're looking at is primarily land acquisitions that will meet our resource needs, and that is going to be very varied across the forest. What they need, some are recreation oriented, some are timber oriented, some are range oriented. But that's what the forests are going to be looking for, is acquisitions that meet the resource and agency mission needs. A lot of it is also dealing with consolidated land ownership patterns. The Western states, I'll start with that a little bit, give you some background there. There's a lot of checkerboard that's going on there that forests are trying to fill in. And those are typically created from the creation or the selection from when the railroads were put in. They had a lot of checkerboard there. The Eastern states are a little bit different. we're rebuilding forests with the Weeks Act as our primarily authority, to where, with the history of the land in the U.S. and how it has been sold and granted over the years, now the government is purchasing it back. And that's what we're trying to do with our eastern forests, is fill in the holes and give us more consistent management areas. So along with that, and one of the primary functions of that is providing access to the public to these public lands. With the fragmented ownership pattern, that's a key component for us with that. So when we look at this, with the criteria, with our goals and objective, one of the key items for us is getting a willing seller with clear title that meets the Department of Justice title standards, and trying to identify projects and land acquisitions that are free from reservations or restrictions that prohibit or limit the agency from their management activities in the near future and in perpetuity is what we're looking for. So that's our main objective. So we've heard a lot of folks talk about the Land and Water Conservation Fund. We're no different. That's our primary funding source. The Great American Outdoors Act in 2020 was a big game changer for us. I would imagine with other agencies as well. What that did for the Forest Service and others is permanently authorize the program and also fully fund it. That for us was very critical to us. That gives us a stable, consistent funding over the years to where we can plan more efficiently over the years and the out years. And it allowed us to hire more staff out there and be able to plan for the coming years with projects, and knowing and understanding that there's more consistent funding out there and it doesn't vary from year to year. The interesting one I want to point out here, Al and I were both surprised at this a couple of years ago when it was pointed out to us, is the LWCF and Land Acquisition Program is the second largest program within the Forest Service, and by quite a bit. It was really interesting to see. We get a funding source or allocation of about 130 million annually. I do want to point out that majority of that, I would say close to 90 million of that, is for our core projects for actual land purchases to cover the purchase of the land. Within that, there are some discretionary funding sources for other purchasing activities, and also to support our due diligence, staffing, and contracting needs. So within the LWCF, there's three types of funding within that we work off of. We've heard from the other agency, the core nomination, that's our biggest funding source. That, like I said, is about 90 million per year for the Forest Service nationally. We have to compete nationally. It's managed nationally as well. And these are our core big projects, multi-million-dollar projects, usually across the nation. And the criteria for that is going to be recreations, threatened and endangered species, watershed partnerships, threat to development, things like that, very similar to the other agencies. The other pots of money that are a little bit smaller to us, and they're both managed within the regions. Each region gets an allocation, and these have been consistent over the years. The allocation that we get, it varies a little bit, but it's staying relatively consistent, is our recreation access and critical end holding. Recreation access is more or less within the title. It is focused on providing access to the public or resolving access to areas that connect other forest areas, and looks at the larger picture of the forest. So the critical inholding is a little bit different too, compared to the rec access. This is more focused on filling what the title says, critical inholding, donut holes. There's a lot of areas out there, say in a wilderness area or a critical management area, that is all we call it Greenland. It's all painted, green as an ownership of the government. And then there's a little white box in there that's privately owned. And that's what this money is for, is to pursue those opportunities and try to acquire those to fill in and get a more consistent management ownership pattern. So like I said, so key is the core projects are managed nationally and compete nationally. The other two are managed regionally and compete within their own regions. And so it's a little bit different, and each have its own little timing. And I'm going to turn it over to Al now. He's going to start talking about how the prioritization and the selection process goes.
Well, Dean, if you just keep sharing, I think we're down to 2 minutes, if not less. Keep sharing. Go to that next screen for me, please. And I'll just say real quick, thank you to the conservation community, the NGOs there that work principally in the Bay. In a former career that I had in private forestry and appraisal, the Mid-Atlantic region was one of my territories. And so 3 of my kids were actually born in Richmond, so very connected to me, and it's a special place to me and my family. I'm going to be fast because I know we're out of time, but Dean's already kind of explained how, the lay of the land and the regions and so forth here with the Forest Service that does relate to the Bay. Out of the 14 national forests that we have in Region 8, we go from Texas, Arkansas, Oklahoma, all the way east and north up to Virginia. Virginia's the northernmost state within our region. And we have the George Washington Jefferson National Forest there in extreme southwest and western Virginia, with some of the headwaters of the James and maybe some of the other rivers that eventually flow to the Bay. So that is the limit of our impact for the Bay, but we certainly want to protect each and every acre that we can, given the significance, resource values and economic values and all of that, that the audience knows much more about than I do. Real quick, recognize please that given delegations of authority and some of the land purchase authorities, Dean mentioned weeks, but we have some, like other federal agencies, we have limitations on what we can do and where. Each national forest has a forest supervisor, and that's the officer with the decision space to determine whether or not they're going to move forward with a land acquisition, new land acquisition. These usually are within our proclaimed boundaries. We can acquire a limited amount of acreage adjacent to or just outside of our boundaries. There's a few extra steps, though, if we do that. And like Dean said, one of our big goals is consolidation. So rarely will we do that, but we can, given the values of the subject property. And so once the forest supervisor determines that this is going to be a priority, they will submit it to the region for LWCF funding under one of those 3 pots of money that Dean just mentioned. And so they'll initiate the project there at the local unit. And we always, here in the regional office, we always encourage the forest to work with partners to write proposals. You guys are experts at writing grants, and we like to see our realty specialist have y'all review, edit, suggest how proposals can be improved. It just makes them all the more stronger, and then we can compete against Region 9 and other regions out to the west a little bit better. So I would, if there's a takeaway here, it would be that any of the NGOs, land trust here in the audience that do operate within the George Washington Jefferson National Forest, please do cultivate a relationship with our land staff there. And before I forget, I will get with you, Chase. I've got some contact information and some other LWCF materials that I will send to you that you perhaps could provide the entire audience, and it could be helpful resources to them.
Absolutely.
So anyway, okay, thank you, Chase. Are we out of time?
Yes.
Oh, Okay, all right then. The next two slides are just about timing of our funding process and how we manage that. And I really can't think of much more that we would introduce that could be new when I compare our work to BLM, Park Service, and Fish and Wildlife. So I'll leave it right there if that's what you want me to do, or I'll continue.
So I think I'll just leave it right there, but we'll circle back for some Q&A around some of these pieces around timing and so forth, and really appreciate what you've shared. It's just chock full of information.
Sounds good.
So now we're going to move to the last agency in this wonderful panel, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and Mark McGeaney, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Bill. Thanks for inviting me, and welcome everybody. Good morning to you all. And also, I didn't appreciate this as much initially. Thank you for putting me last in the lineup, because there is so much overlap between the agencies. So I won't dwell on the similarities, but there are many. I represent the Fish and Wildlife Service's Northeast region. That's the 13 states from Maine to Virginia. Within that region, we have 72 national wildlife refuges. That's where our focus is with land acquisition, land protection. Of those 72 refuges, we're currently active in about 20. We have probably going on about 20 different national life refuges, more than 100 projects in play at any one time, well more than 100 projects in play. And of course, as you've heard earlier, some of these projects are multi-year efforts, despite our best efforts. So then in the Chesapeake, and Chase, if you want to pop up, if you have the ability to do that, my slide, we can bring this into the Chesapeake region, where, of the refuges in the region, we've got major focus in land protection, about 6 or 8 refuges. Within the Chesapeake region, you'll see these red blobs. This is, I apologize, a little bit of a busier map because it shows all of the Fish and Wildlife Service facilities, including fish hatcheries and administrative offices. The refuges are maybe the darker font, and certainly with the red polygons. So again, 15 national wildlife refuges in the Chesapeake watershed. We're active. And I should say most of the refuges in the Chesapeake don't have a whole lot of room to grow, which I guess I could say is a good thing. All of our refuges have what are called approved acquisition boundaries. These are publicly vetted. They've all gone through the NEPA process, and the boundary is approved by our director. That gives us carte blanche to work with willing sellers within that approved acquisition boundary. Again, in the Chesapeake region, many of the refuges boundaries have already been filled out, or nearly so. So there isn't, a lot of the opportunity isn't widespread. Targets are fairly narrow, and our major focus has been in 2 or 3 refuges in the Chesapeake region, those being Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge, Rappahannock River Valley National Wildlife Refuge, and Patuxent Research Refuge. We do have, as a kind of a teaser, there will be, knock wood, in the next few weeks, a formal proposal out to the public to review our creation of a new National Wildlife Refuge in Southern Maryland, be called Southern Maryland Woodlands National Wildlife Refuge. And that's a really exciting thing for us. There aren't too many new refuges established over time. The last one in our region was in 2016. So the several years between new refuges, but that would be another new opportunity for us. We are a decentralized entity, just like the last folks were mentioning with the Forest Service. Things begin at those refuges, and I was nodding my head, if you could see me, about establishing relationships with our leaders are called refuge managers. So getting to know the refuge managers who are responsible for those geographies, those land bases. The criteria are pretty simple for lands that we pursue. Willing seller within an approved acquisition boundary, important habitats that meet the refuge's purposes. Similar to the Park Service, every National Life Refuge has a list of purposes. Some are established administratively, some are established congressionally. They're often quite similar, but there can be differences, and they're largely about conserving migratory birds. That's the genesis of the Fish and Wildlife Service. That's what our focus has been. And looking at, willing sellers within a boundary, important habitats, those filter to the region. Our process is, if I'm talking about core LWCF funding, those dollars that would be appropriated, go into the president's budget and be appropriated by Congress. Those projects are, they filter to me in the regional office. We're one of 8 regions in the country. And the projects are then filtered by biological criteria. And I'm not going to get into the details of that. I will say that it's on the surface, it's fairly simple. However, there are scoring matrices and flow charts that would make your head spin. The focus is on meeting what we call our agency's strategic growth priorities. So those would be migratory birds and threatened and endangered species. So every project that we want to put forward is scored, and it gets a numeric score for migratory birds. And migratory birds, it's 1/3 of the score is for waterfowl. That's really our bread and butter, migratory waterfowl. 1/3 is for all other migratory birds, shorebirds, land birds, water birds. They're combined into 1/3 of the score. And then threatened and endangered species. And the key, these are federally threatened and endangered species, not state. Federally T&E species, and land protection has to be part of a recovery plan for those species. Unfortunately, a fair number of T&E species don't have recovery plans, and there's a smaller number of plans that actually prescribe land protection as part of the recovery strategy for those species. So projects aren't scored individually. The refuge is scored through this system. It's called TRACT, TRACT. And I meet, the projects go in, we're 2 years in advance. So this May of 2024, we will be projecting where we can use funds in 2026. Things will go out in the president's 2026 budget. So it helps to have a pipeline of projects, to know that there are projects out there that will be there when we get the funding, if we get the funding to meet that need. So starts in about May of this year. Things are scored, and then I meet with my counterparts, and it's a very simple table, and it goes from the highest biologically scored refuge down to the lowest, and each realty officer is able to describe the projects and the dollars that they need. And we've got a set, kind of a cut line based on history, and it's similar to what you heard from the other agencies. Projects are $60 million or so, and we build it out to as many projects as we have, and it can reach 70, 80, 90, $100 million. And that's all information for the administration to say, well, if it's a flush year, here's where we could use some additional funding. That's what goes off to headquarters, goes to DOI, and then some other horse trading may occur and have influence on what goes out in the president's budget. That's the core funding. As the others described, we also have access to recreational access funds. That's periodically through the year. I don't have a set timeline. If we've got a project, we can submit it. Likewise, we've got funding for incidental acquisitions. The technical terms, there are two funding sources. One is for in-holdings, and the other is emergency hardship. They have their own fiscal code, and those are on an as-needed basis. If we have those opportunities, and they're really, those are two, I think, underappreciated funding sources, because we may get, if we're lucky, we may get core LWCF funding at one refuge. This past year, I think we scored 4 or 5 refuges, which is really good for our region. But there are still dozens of other refuges that you know, if we're going to get core funding, we're going to look for a substantial amount of money.
Sure.
$500,000 to several, millions of dollars. There are refuges where opportunities, occur when a refuge manager has someone knocking on their front door to say that it's time for them to move south. They can't take the winters any longer. And so the in-holding and emergency hardship accounts are really, really critical, because we outperform the other regions, Fish and Life Service, in that regard every year, with probably 8 or so projects where we rely on that funding.
Mark, that's
think
really
I'll
wonderful.
leave
Any
it.
last messages here?
My main takeaway is quality projects. Get to know your refuge manager locally. Come up with quality projects, because projects equal dollars.
That sounds like a great
That's right.
message, and we'll be talking about that the rest of the session. So thank you so much, and apologize to all of you for not having enough time, but that's where we really want to center in on Q&A. And we're going to start it off, as I mentioned at the beginning, with Ben and I asking questions. Ben's going to ask the first couple. We'll direct them at different panelists. We encourage you to fill that Q&A section. There's some interesting questions in there already. And so after Ben and I ask some questions, we'll switch over to those of you who have questions, and some of the interesting priority questions that are already there. So Ben, over to you.
Thanks, Bill. And well said, everyone. And Mark, you ended it on a great note of, quality projects equal funding. And a question that we get a lot is with folks that have quality projects. So if they have relationships with those landowners that want to sell or donate their land, or they want to have an easement on their land, can you talk a little bit more for the best way for the land trust or other organizations to get on your priority lists and work with you through those properties? And Bill, if you could help us kind of
Sure.
navigate through the different agencies on that question.
So Jeff, you already partially responded to that in the Q&A with somebody's question. Can you elaborate on how a land trust might approach you and what that would look like? And then I'll switch over to the other panelists.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's similar to what the other agencies have described. It's really up to the local manager to decide whether it's a priority or whether it meets the missions. For us, it's in the Chesapeake area, there are special recreation management areas, which are a BLM designation. Congress hasn't designated or anything. BLM, through an open land use plan, is designated a special recreation management area, and that management area has specific objectives that and so working with the local manager, the field manager, or our eastern states is a little bit of a different animal compared to our areas in the west. There's lots of field managers in the west who make these initial contacts with. Well, our eastern states is quite a bit different that way. Some people might have opportunity to go straight to the state director and try and see if it would be a priority. But I would encourage to work with a local field manager and talk about those things that are important to this recreation area, special management recreation area, and then see if it meets the mission, and then move forward in that fashion.
Mm-hmm. Jeff, if I can follow up with a question. You spoke specifically in your presentation about non-federal partners and their importance in sort of shepherding through the process. if you were to describe the role of a non-federal partner, which certainly a land trust would be, as well as a whole bunch of others, what are the key roles a non-federal partner plays?
I think the biggest role is they have the ability to react a lot quicker than we do as the federal government. They're able to put in option agreements to work with a landowner and put the property under contract so that they don't sell it to somebody else, and then with clear notification that they're going to eventually try and move this property to the federal government or to the BLM. And so that probably is one of the most key components that our federal or non-federal partners provide, is locking down that property so nobody else can come in and steal it or snake it out from under everybody. And so that, and then just that relationship with the landowner, we're a bureaucracy and it's hard to develop that personal one-on-one relationship with the federal government. But the NGOs definitely have that ability. You guys are way more charismatic than we are, and people like you a lot better than they like us, is what it seems. So yeah, those are some of the big takeaways, is putting contracts under, or properties under contract, and then working with the government to facilitate that with the landowner.
That's really helpful, Jeff. Nadine and Jen, Park Service, what would you add? What would you tweak that's different for the Park Service in terms of land trusts and others approaching you?
Well, I think the key is coordination early. And as Jeff mentioned, with the folks on the ground initially, with the superintendents, and making sure that land trust priority is actually a priority for that park as well. Yeah. And the park superintendents know to bring in the lands group early.
Sure.
Because the parcel could be a priority, it could be wonderful, but there may be limitations on acquisition at that park. Some parks have acreage limitations, some have monetary limitations, some can only, part of the parks you can only accept by donation only. So there's all those things that you need to know as a partner before you get, and we always talk about getting out ahead of us. We need to make sure we're all coordinating, we're all on the same page. So there's nothing where the land trust says, okay, we're ready to sell to the Park Service. And we're like, well, you're in the area where we can only accept donations, so we can't pay you for that property. Or, we don't know we're going to get the funding for that for another 2 years. So we just want to make it's the expectations, making sure we're all on the same page.
Yeah.
Jen, is there some master spreadsheet up in the cloud that somebody could use to figure out who takes donations, who has money, etc.?
It's the actual enabling legislation for each unit.
Okay.
Yeah, and so there's no secret. Just go to the law that created that unit, or in a few cases, the presidential proclamation. It will say very clearly what we can and cannot do there.
That makes a lot of sense.
But the easiest thing to do is contact your park and they'll contact the lands office, because we have this at our fingertips, and the legislation's there, but it's not always 100% clear.
Yeah.
And so you want to be talking to the realty expert so they give you the right information.
Super. Thank you, Jen and Nadine. Dean and Al, Forest Service, land trusts, what do you look for?
Me or Dean? Go ahead, Dean. I've got an answer too.
Watch this game of volleyball. Go ahead, Dean.
Yeah, not a whole lot difference in what Jeff and Jen and Nadine has said. The key component for the Forest Service is connect with that unit that the parcel is on. Work with that forest supervisor early to identify if it's a priority for the forest. They have a lot of opportunities out there that they're pursuing, and they need to understand what the priority ranking of things. And if one comes in even higher than what they're working on, they can work with that and reprioritize. But that's the key, to understand what the forest is looking for. What are their standards? What's the title standards? Clear title is pretty important to the eastern forest, to understand what can be accepted for future management activities. So understanding the standards and the priorities of the unit are key. So I'll leave it over to Al. What do you got, Al?
I'll add this. I mean, Forest Service is under USDA. USDA is a huge agency, so we have a lot of sister agencies, and these other agencies do a fair amount of less than fee type work. Forest Service extremely rarely ever does anything like that. In fact, in Region 8, it's really hard to get our Office of General Counsel to approve title, given our mission, which is starkly different from our other sister agencies.
Yeah.
So, less than fee type acquisition work, very rare in the Southeast. And it might be that this project fits another program or state and private forestry, forest legacy, something like that. But do always, take it, like Dean said, to a forest supervisor. Could be that the resource values are such that we would entertain working with the partner on something like that.
That makes a ton of sense. And Mark, batting cleanup, you got everybody to answer for you.
Yeah,
What would you tweak here? And we'll start with you next time.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that land trusts are by definition local. They've got their ear to the ground. Refuge, so they know what's going on and who's who and what's active. And a refuge manager is a Jack or Jill of all trades. They may have a focus on land protection. Many refuge managers don't. So having the land trust with their ear to the ground, being able to be the first contact with landowners, having those relationships in the community, and bringing those to the refuge manager's attention for his or her vetting or approval, I think is key.
Mm-hmm. What I'd add to what all of the speakers offered to you is, in terms of collaboration, you never want to be asking a really tough question of someone to spend a lot of money the first time you've met them. This is an opportunity to go out and build relationships with people, figure out their priorities, and then you can begin to search for projects that meet their priorities. So Ben, do you have another question, or should we switch over?
Yes. So the Land and Water Conservation Fund, we were lucky that it was permanently authorized with the Great American Outdoors Act a few years ago. However, since then, unfortunately, we've been seeing a lot, really the vast majority of that funding going out west and outside of our watershed. So how can we really get more of that federal side LWCF funding focused in this region, in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, where there are so many people, so many opportunities for water quality improvement, for public access, etc.
Mm-hmm. Mark, a thought on that to kick off our conversation?
Yeah, well, again, I'm focused on our national wildlife refuges, and in my presentation, I mentioned that there were really just a handful of refuges that had substantial opportunity for land protection. Thankfully, they score fairly well in that biological scoring matrix, so they will compete. They will compete well. Blackwater and Rappahannock River Valley refuges compete well, and I think as long as we have projects that we can put those dollars toward, I think we'll do okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say the eastern, for Fish and Wildlife Service, eastern refuges do quite well compared to some of the western refuges. So I don't know that there's necessarily an east-west divide that's very stark in Fish and Wildlife.
Okay. So Jeff, you actually have LWCF in your title, or at least one of your titles. I get a sense you have 3 or 4 titles. Thoughts on pulling more LWCF dollars into the region?
Yeah, I mean, speaking for BLM, we first got to get that $1.4 million spent, which is pre Great American Outdoors Act funds. It was 2017 is when we got those funds, and so There's great risk that we're going to lose those funds soon through what's called a rescission, where Congress tells us that we got to give some money back, put some money back in the coffer. And so there's great risk that we could potentially lose that funding, and then you're starting scratch. But those are funds right now on the table, ready to go for Meadowwoods from a willing landowner in coordination with the BLM. And I know it's a priority for the Eastern States Office to get that money spent. They just don't really have a home for it, a willing landowner to participate, which is with such a small area, that's really hard to find. But the nice thing with BLM is we're not tied to the same boundary restrictions that the other agencies are tied to. So we have opportunity. We also have opportunity. I think there's some trails and some national historic trails, national scenic trails through the area. And those, I think, are opportunities for additional LWCF funding that crosses multiple boundaries and potential funding for those projects in the future. So thinking about those larger landscapes, as somebody else brought up in the Q&A, working larger landscapes is difficult because everybody has so many different missions, but it's possible. We do it successfully. BLM does it successfully with the Forest Service in the West, and I don't see why we couldn't replicate that in other areas with other agencies.
Thanks, Jeff. Any of the other panelists want to speak to LWCF dollars?
I will real fast. I think one of the things we should do or could do better is telling our story when we have a success. And we're trying to do more of that within the Forest Service. Never forget the people are here in the East, and let these delegations in Congress know that we do hit base hits and home runs. And when we do, the benefit, to the public is very, very measurable.
Sure.
One last thing, don't be discouraged. Reached out to a panelist on the national LWCF panel last year to ask, how in the world do y'all compare a salamander to the grizzly bear, to the Canadian lynx, that kind of thing? And this person was very quick to tell me that they do reconcile scoring of Eastern more proposals. They try to, make them, we have a level playing field was the message that I got. So don't be discouraged. Let's keep sending up these good land acquisition proposals.
Love it. Anyone else? Okay. So I think we're going to move to some of the questions that are in the Q&A, and I'm going to ask Chase to bring Wendy up. Wendy,
Yep.
You have 2 questions in the Q&A, both of them about coordination, and would really love to have you ask them directly.
1 second. I'm going to do that now.
And just for all, after Wendy, we'll turn to Melissa's question and then to Joel. So Wendy, over to you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Great. Well, thanks for the panelists for being here. This is exciting. And, the National Park Service and DOI in general has been the lead on large landscape conservation for the Chesapeake under that executive order that Joe started us and grounded us with, 13508. So, FISH and BLM and USGS and the Park Service and our friends over at the Forest Service have been for years working on strategies to advance land conservation across the watershed. And so I'm just wondering, at the level of our panelists here that are, really focused on the land acquisition side, whether you all meet regularly or annually to share priorities, to coordinate across the watershed. And then if you don't, I think both the NPS Chesapeake office, as well as our broader land conservation partnership, would be happy to help host and facilitate that sort of cross-agency collaboration.
Mm-hmm. How about if we start on the Park Service, Nadine and Jen?
Sure. So the bureaus do actually meet on a monthly basis, our federal land acquisition folks. We talk about a whole range of different issues. including the budget, the federal budget process, and where we're going with our lists. So that is happening.
Keep on going, Nadine.
So Wendy, I think if you are willing to host the managers of the local sites to talk amongst themselves, that would be the next piece that would probably be helpful to the effort. But the bureaus, we on this call, except for Forest Service, we have somebody different from Forest Service come and join us, meet and talk on a monthly basis. So I don't think, again, back to the communication piece that was brought up, we do all these things. We don't necessarily go out and, wave big banners saying, look at what we did. Aren't we great? We just keep doing our jobs and recognize this is part of it as stewards of the resource for the whole of the American people.
You're on mute, Wendy.
And I'm thankful to hear that you all meet regularly, and that's great. And I definitely agree that the connections down to the managers, whether that's a refuge manager, a park superintendent, recreation area, site manager is key, and we can certainly help with those connections. I do think being quiet about our work and the success of our work harms us. And so I think that we actually need to be loud and proud about the work that we are doing in large landscape conservation, because when people know about success, more success and more resources come. So, I think looking at the success that the Fish and Wildlife Service has had on the Eastern Shore with, the big work that's been done around and in support of Blackwater is an example to model and try to replicate across the watershed.
Mm-hmm.
Makes sense.
Other panelists want to chime in? And there's often a tension I find between the loud and proud and the let's do our work and keep it amongst us as we do our internal deliberations. So, Mark, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I'll say that at the local level, there are quite effective partnership groups that have been in place for several years. One at Blackwater, one at Rappahannock River Valley, and they include other federal partners, NGOs ranging from local land trusts to state-based organizations to national organizations. And the folks gather a couple times a year, share their priorities, figure out who's the best fit to meet some of those larger conservation challenges. So, it's not necessarily, I think this all began out of the question about the major federal agencies getting together. That may happen at the headquarters level, higher levels, when we're within the region or within the watershed. These more focused partnership groups, I think, are quite effective.
Good to know. Jeff, Dean, Al, anything to add?
I think it was well covered.
Marvelous. So we're going to switch to another question, and watching some of the chat go back and forth. If you guys could hear the snowball fight happening in my next door neighbor, it would be hard for all of us to hear. And so Chase is going to ask Melissa's question because Melissa has children in play. And so Melissa, thank you for being here. And Chase, over to you.
Yep. So Melissa asks, would be curious to understand any relationships or model projects the presenters for LWCF have developed with the support of federally recognized and or non-federally recognized tribes in the region.
Mm-hmm. So who'd like to kick off our conversation here? Working with tribes, federally recognized and not.
I can go. So with BLM, we've recently really kicked up our coordination on LWCF with tribes in the last couple of years. We last year was the first time in the 10 years I've been working in Land and Water Conservation Fund for BLM that we actually received letters of support from tribes. Generally speaking, tribal governments and tribal members don't like to talk about why they want the federal government, or at least BLM, to acquire land, because there's something special there that they don't want people to know about. That's why they want us to get it, right? There's a burial site, or there's a traditional tribal property use or something that goes on in that area, and they don't want to make that public. So they don't trust us to tell us why it's important, because they don't want everybody else to know about it. And so we've really been able to kick that up and build those relationships with those tribes at the local level. Yeah, we do have some models. There are in the West, a couple of project areas where we have massive tribal support and tribal coordination, to the point where the tribes are coming with our NGOs, the conservation, or the Nature Conservancy, and they're going out and meeting, and they're planting traditional use plants on the property and getting it going before the BLM acquires the property. And so those are the kind of things that are starting to happen in the West, and I would hope that we could replicate that in the Chesapeake Bay area as well.
Others, please chime in. It's an important topic.
It is an important topic. So we have the Trail of Tears within Region 8. We have, like I said, the Ouachita National Forest bleeds over into Oklahoma. So we have a strong presence here with tribal governments. Certainly, we notify when we do land acquisition work, and we always invite and solicit feedback. When we do land exchange work, we're willing to do any kind of consultation if ever needed. But we just follow the protocol of keeping our tribal governments aware of the work we're doing here. That's really all I could add.
And Mark, have you been involved with fish on Phones Cliff and some of the related projects?
Yeah. There's been a really wonderful and growing, expanding relationship with the Rappahannock tribe, Rappahannock Nation, and that's largely between tribal representatives and the refuge manager, refuge staff, and other NGO partners in the region. I think the question, and that's evolved into other forms of partnering, land stewardship, intern programs, what have you. I think the question was mostly about targeting LWCF funding, and that's not really something that we've done. As I described, our scoring nationally and ratings are based on biological values that are integral to the service mission. I think it's really a matter of the one-on-one relationship between tribal representatives and refuge managers to bring to light projects that would warrant exploring and perhaps acquiring to add to the refuge boundary.
Yeah, makes a ton of sense. Anybody else on connections to tribal nations? Okay. Wendy? And you're on mute again.
I would just share, and I'll put in the chat, both the National Park Service Chesapeake Gateways Office and the Captain John Smith Chesapeake National Historical Trail have done the research and engaged with tribal partners to create what are called Indigenous Cultural Landscapes reports. And that helps identify the areas, the lands, the lifeways of Indigenous peoples, so that as we're looking at priorities for land conservation, it's helping to elevate those areas that are being identified by our tribal and Indigenous partners themselves. So I'll put in the chat some of those resources. They've been done in the Chesapeake, sort of following the major riverways for the Chesapeake. So that is steps in, remember when, Cherry was showing the big steps for MPS, that planning phase where you're doing the research and the understanding of the areas. So I'll put that in the chat as background information, and that's valuable beyond just the NPS. It's valuable at the state level for state level land acquisition programs, individual private land trusts, the tribes themselves, as well as our federal partners.
Thanks, Wendy. And as we all know, some of that planning can't start when you're talking about a transaction. You have to do some planning before particular transactions, and those kinds of landscape reports for indigenous cultures are so important. We're going to move over to Joel. Joel, you have a question in the chat about the Appalachian Corridor and its recognition by TNC.
I'm going to go ahead and read that. Joel asked me to read his question. So
Okay, thank you.
this question was directed towards Dean. Given that the Appalachian Corridor has been identified by TNC and others as one of the world's most important migratory corridors for wildlife in the face of climate change, why don't more land acquisition funds go to fill out and connect the various national forests in the east? You did one large acquisition at Grace Furnace in 2017, but no big ones since then that I know of. Shouldn't this be a major priority?
So folks, Appalachian Trail, TNC, global priority. What are some of the things there? Dean, this was initially directed at you. If you can speak to that first.
Yeah, this might bleed over to Al too in Region 8 here. As the Grace Furnace one's not ringing a bell to me. I wonder if that's a Region 8 one. Good. So I wasn't familiar with that one, but recreation, at least in the East, is a key component for the Forest Service, and try and get those opportunities and access to it. And forests have done a pretty good job overall in identifying and connecting the trails and providing access for folks. In particular with the Appalachian Trail, it really is going to depend on the forest and where it's located, and their priorities. We do support that regionally with that type of an acquisition. If there's a willing seller and the opportunity exists, the forest will typically go after that. Here in the East, it's just kind of the nature of how things work out. We don't have a large pot of lands out there that have large acreage out there. We're more competitive with the smaller acreage ones, and really getting a small acreage can solve a lot of issues. Sometimes they're a little bit better management tools and getting large blocks of land. They can get big bang for your buck, I'd say. But really, what I would say is it's going to depend on the unit, what they find as a priority, and go after, and the regional support that. Anything with trails, recreation, connecting recreation opportunities and access really score well within the region and also nationally. And anytime we can get a national trail in there as well, it just increases the value of that property and the score. But I'll turn it over to you, since maybe Grace Furnace is more in your neck of the woods.
Thanks. And yeah, Grace Furnace was about a 4,700 acre single block of land that we acquired just prior to the pandemic, or just after the pandemic, on the GW Southwest Virginia. But I definitely agree. The Southern Apps is one of our region's high focal areas, and TNC does some amazing work there. I'm aware of, I believe it's Cumberland Forest. I see that as giving some opportunity for TNC and the Forest Service to do some additional large scale type work in Kentucky, Virginia. But each and every year, and you see it in the federal budget that is finally approved, we're getting money for the Cherokee NFs in North Carolina, Chattahoochee, and the GW because they score so high. The resource values are incredible in the Appalachians there. So we're definitely wanting to do more work there.
Good to know. And Nadine and Jen, obviously the Appalachian Trail is a Park Service unit as well,
Oh,
a
yeah.
big long one. How does it fit for the Park Service?
It is one of the places where we love sending our recreational access money to.
Hmm.
Yeah. The one thing that I'm noticing as people are talking about these opportunities, we all have this important criteria that land trusts can certainly help us with. And that is called there has to be a willing seller.
Yeah.
So without that, we can want that beautiful acreage from now until the cows come home. But if they're not willing to work with the federal government on our side.
Mm-hmm. And I also work with the AT, and there's been some question around accepting land. Is that something that comes up? And I have no idea what the authorization legislation says about the Appalachian Trail, but
So I'm the old person here, and I am able to go and sign that paperwork if my boss doesn't like my answer. So y'all have been familiar with these people that live at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue every 4 years. You know how they change what they think about? Well, you kind of have something similar with managers too.
got it. That's a kind way to say it. So,
As if I'm not on this next call, you know why.
oh, Nadine, we love you. All good. Anybody else want to add anything about the AT? I know it's a piece of it. Jeff, you raised your hand.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Congress lately has introduced a couple of bills related to completion of the Continental Divide Trail.
Yep.
And so I don't know. This is one of the areas where our NGOs have ability to approach certain legislators to introduce legislation where we obviously don't have that ability or power to do that. So I don't know if there's any proposed legislation out there related to the trail, but if there's not, this is an opportunity for NGOs to get involved to help to create some legislation. And the thing is driving the Continental Divide Trail is the anniversary is coming up. The 50-year anniversary is coming up for the dedication of the trail. And so Congress wants that trail completed, or wants to make an effort to make that trail completed prior to the anniversary.
Interesting. So, AT's coming up 100-year anniversary. Fascinating. So we're going to move to another question. Chase, you're going to ask Lisa's question, and then I see one in here from Cassidy as well.
Yes, that's correct. And I know that Lisa's got her question did get an answer from Nadine, but just want to pose it to the larger body. For a presidential birth site in the Chesapeake Bay watershed with public access, what would be the first step to determine the federal interest in establishing a new national monument for the property?
Anyone want to pick that up? And you can feel free to
Is the question,
Nadine, build on what you said. Okay.
I guess I would just ask whether the question is what is the congressional process versus what is a process that that all presidents have authority around, which is a proclamation process. Either one typically starts with a thorough assessment of national significance with there's 4 criteria for inclusion in the national park system. And so there's a study step to determine eligibility and fit and to fit the criteria for inclusion in the system. So whatever the specifics were, we could help think through which sort of path, either path really does require this step of studying the criteria for inclusion.
Hey, Wendy, it's Lisa. Thank you. And I'll just reach out to you directly if that's okay to figure it out. Okay?
Sure.
Thanks, Wendy.
Thanks to both of you. So we're going to move to the question from Cassidy Lord. Cassidy, do you want to be put on screen, or would you like someone to ask the question for you.
Oh, and Lisa, I'd love to follow up with you about that as well.
Marvelous, Ben. Go ahead, Cassidy or Chase, but you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Cassie, I just gave you permissions there and I'd be happy. Oh, I can ask it. I'm sorry about that. Let me go ahead and do that. Cassie's question was, how does the current shortage in land appraisers impact land acquisition for the agencies? Are there training programs, agency sponsored / funded or otherwise, to get appraisers trained and in the field?
Mm-hmm. Anybody want to respond to that? And we have heard in different meetings that a shortage of real estate professionals impedes the process here. And so if anybody can speak to that, Mark, you want to kick it off?
Yeah, sure. I think there's a question nested within a question.
Yes.
And I would say that yeah, there are in certain parts of the watershed and my region a lack of appraisers who are qualified to do yellow book appraisals. And I think the bigger question is the appraisal function overall. And I think all of us in DOI work through, I can't speak for the Forest Service and Department of Agriculture, but within DOI, there's a separate office called Appraisal Valuation Services Office established. It's been renamed since its inception.
Mm-hmm.
Been around for a dozen years maybe, and those the folks who are actually doing the deal, working through the transaction, and the seller. And for all the good intention, it's turned out to be very, very time consuming. And there are lots of reasons for that. And I guess I'd say that I think they keep shifting the milestone of when an appraisal should be prepared within what period of time. And it's grown from, I don't know, 3 months to 4 months to now they think 6 months is a pretty good turnaround. And frankly, they're often not meeting that. And you can understand the implications that has for a seller who, probably doesn't have much experience with. So that's a really big issue. It's something that is being addressed within DOI, and I think especially with Park Service and Fish and Wildlife, and I think we're going to see some changes in how we do that in the next few months. And I think I hope things are going to start improving. I won't go any further, Bill, but I just also want to say that this leads me to another concern for capacity. And, there are several components. I think, Jen did a nice job with her table about due diligence and all that work that has to occur. Appraisals are an issue. Hopefully we'll get that addressed. It doesn't mean we're home free. There's still, in my view, there's a lot of work to do with survey, title, what have you, and just having the capacity within the agencies, or if there are ways to kind of share that responsibility with partners to try and speed up the acquisition process.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you, Mark. Really appreciate that. And there's another capacity question in the Q&A. If anybody wants to tackle it, we're going to move into the home stretch, but want to see if there's any other comments on this question of appraisers and real estate professionals and the kind of folks we need to move land deals forward. Anyone else? So we want to do a quick round robin with the panelists at the end. What encouragement might you offer to the panelists? What sense of direction might you offer? You know that you have, at this point, 50 some people who want to make land acquisition happen. And there's a lot of energy there. And would love for you just to provide some guidance as to, you know, if you were actually sitting at the bar at NCTC with one of these people, what advice would you be offering to them around moving some land acquisition conversations forward with your agency? And I know some of you are going to provide contacts for different local level managers that will help people on the ground after this meeting. But imagine you're sitting there at the bar with one of these folks. What would you be guiding them? And Jeff will go back to the original order for the land and then turn it to Ben for last thoughts. Jeff.
Yeah, I think I mean, down and dirty, I think the idea of getting together regularly a couple times a year with all the parties, the federal parties and the non-federal parties together, is a critical thing. I know that this has been some of the collaborative projects in the past are still moving forward outside of the federal process. Those collaborative groups have stayed together. They can still meet regularly, and they still have success getting funds and doing projects, even though they might not be multiple agencies, but they're still having success individually with each agency. And I think bringing everybody back together or regularly meeting keeps the wheels turning.
Marvelous. Thank you, Jeff. Jen?
Uh-oh. Jen, do you have anything?
Jen's frozen, it seems. How
Oh,
about you,
no.
Nadine?
Oh, no, she's even further north than we are here in the DMV. The most critical thing I can think of is cultivate willing sellers for us.
Love it.
You all are boots on the ground in so many other places than we are on a regular basis.
Find those willing sellers.
Yeah.
Jen, what would you add? You're back. But you're muted. We can't hear you. I'm sorry, Jen, we can't hear you. Maybe you can experiment a little bit. Al, how about you?
If I was at a bar with a partner, I'd definitely buy their drink. And I tell you, you don't have a partnership without relationship. And I want our partners to know that we view them in a much more higher value way. They're not just transactional outfits that help us get the deal done. We all have our personal war stories about urbanization and how it's taken off or taken away a place that we find near and dear. We're all in this together. We're all fighting a common monster called urbanization. And bear with us as we work through our federal processes. We're very like-minded in our objectives and goals, but it's just our hands are tied sometimes as far as funding and speed and capacity and all of those things.
Appreciate that, Al. Dean, how about you? And then we'll try Jen again.
Yeah, echo what Al said, and as a follow-up to that, I would say those relationships with the local units, the forests, and understanding those personalities and trying to get a common goal of your priorities in transactions set and working together on that. I think it goes a long way. We do have turnover within our agency, sometimes more often than not. So those multiple visits to understand personalities and get that working relationship is critical.
Sounds wise, Dean, because people do leave and there's new folks and you got to have relationships with all of them. Jen, can we try again? We can't hear you. I'm sorry. Maybe shut off your video and try that. No, I'm sorry. We can't hear you, Jen. So Mark, last word before we turn it over to Ben.
Yeah, I'm afraid it'd be repeating what others have. It would be getting to know the local refuge manager, finding out where your goals align. And then, yes, absolutely. You're the land trust or the boots on the ground. They're the ones to know the players, the landowners, and know when those prime properties might be ripe for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mark. Ben, bring us to a close.
Before we wrap up, I've been asked if we could just slip in one or two more questions that someone had. Chase?
Hi, yeah, we're gonna just ask these real quick, but I want to make sure that we keep close to time here. So, I'm just gonna go ahead and throw Andrew's question out here real quick and give him a chance to speak if he needs to. But the average land trust has 1 to 2 staff and 150K budget. If you are interested in a project funding that cannot also be used to cover the staff time to manage those projects, please advise, brainstorm, or help us learn about how your programs can help accommodate overreaching needs. Thank you.
Any thoughts around those capacity building dollars and helping short-staffed land trusts? It's a hard one. We know from past conversations.
I will tell you our acquisition management funds we get through LWCF, we cannot use to give to a land trust to pay for their staff time. So our hands are tied in that way. We can, in some instances, work with land trust and landowners to help with due diligence costs, but that's a case by case basis. I wouldn't count on that.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay, Ben, I think bring it home.
Okay, well, I just wanted to take a moment, first of all, to thank our panelists for all their generous time and energy and work on this. It's clear to see, all of us are really trying to move towards the same goals of trying to see how we can conserve land for the benefit of everyone here in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I think that there was a lot of really great information that was put out, but some of it, because of time constraints, we had to go through pretty quickly. And I know many of them have graciously offered to provide some resources that we're going to be following up with folks after, such as some contact information for, the different places nearby of the folks that you can reach out to, some information on, where the coverage is, the maps, etc., and the presentations, as well as this recording will be available for everyone afterwards. But I really hope that this is not the end, but rather the beginning of a great conversation about how we can all work together in partnership to make sure that we can help accelerate the pace of land conservation in this region. I love the ideas of us coming together and bringing folks together on a regular basis to try to hash some of these things out, and some of the great ideas that came out here on this call. So thank you all so much for taking the time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to an extraordinary set of panelists. We really appreciate all your wisdom and guidance, and enjoy your snow day, at least for those of us in the Mid-Atlantic. Probably not in Milwaukee. I don't know. Take care, everybody.
Thanks.
All right, Ben, I'm going to stop the recording now.